What's happening, my man? We got a good one today.
I know, dude. It is going to be a good one. We rarely have guests on, but when we do them for you. We want good information. We want you to feel informed, and as Ironman.com would say, we want you to feel empowered. But
Empowered.
no, yeah, Ken Hammond has been on twice or maybe even three times now. For us, he's an awesome guy. We love having him on. Super informative. He's the race director for used to be the race director for Syracuse 70.3. He is the current race director for Ohio 70.3, which this year would have been its fifth. And then he was also going to be the new race director for Ironman's new acquisition, which is Musselman 70.3, and I think that was going to happen in August or September. But he's on. He's awesome. But hey, we appreciate you as always tuning in. Today is June 15th, 2020. Crushing Iron Podcast 382.
That's right. Yep. And he's great, man. We just talked to him actually, and he goes through it all. If you have any questions about how race directors and or Ironman in general has been dealing with this and how they've been looking at it and how they go about postponing or thinking about postponing or canceling races or what they're thinking about doing going forward, it's all in here.
Take a listen and then remember, be kind.
Yeah, be kind. He's a good dude. Like you said in the podcast, race directors are humans too. So I guess just kick back and listen to quite a long podcast.
Yeah, this is a
Might be our
long name. This is
longest.
a PR. We'll have to put this one on our podcast Strava. This is I think a new long one for us, but I could have kept going. I could have asked more, but we try to keep it short, not take up too much of his time. Enjoy our podcast today with the man, Ken Hammond.
There he
Giddy.
is.
What's going on?
Not much, buddy. How are you?
Good.
Yeah. Are you lying?
No. I mean, I can't move. We did had an 80-mile ride yesterday with almost 10,000 feet of climbing.
Holy crap!
Yeah. We've got a ride out here. It's called Dante's. It's 140 miles, 14,000 feet of climbing. So we're getting ready to do that in 2 weeks.
Dante's Inferno is what it sounds like.
That's exactly it.
I mean, is this because you have a little bit of free time now, or you were planning on doing this anyway?
Nope. This is there's no racing. There's no events to produce. So yeah, I got a bunch of free time now.
So let me ask you this: when you're not involved in like the hour by hour, day to day planning of these races, what else are you doing?
For the last year and a half, I was working part-time at a school, just trying to find something to fill the winters.
Mm-hmm.
And then otherwise, that's really about it. I've got a few small events that I produce, but thankfully 2020, I was taking a step back. So whatever it was, I just got lucky and didn't have to deal with all of this.
So for our first time listeners, give us I mean, I think a lot of them have probably actually listened to your previous one or two about Ohio 70.3, but give us your general background in the sport or in race directing and Ironman. I know you were originally with Syracuse 70.3. Was that your first lead race directing one that you had for Ironman, and then Ohio, and then obviously what was going to be the newer one with Musselman this year, and then we'll kind of hop into some questions about the year and what's made things so difficult, and then probably try to give hopefully give our listeners just kind of a better understanding of the role of a race director and what you guys actually have responsibilities over and can make calls on, and then just kind of the difficulties that have been the last 90 to 100 days with this COVID pandemic and canceling races and moving races and all the fun stuff in between.
Yeah, so it's I started race directing in 2010 when I was brought in as an assistant race director for Syracuse 70.3, and was kind of just thrown into the fire for 2011. So that was my first full year solo race directing Syracuse 70.3. I think it was like 2014, 2013, I took on Iron Girl Syracuse as well, and for a few years grew with them and race directed upwards of 3 different Iron Girl events. One in Syracuse, one in Massachusetts, and then one in Sandy Hook, New Jersey. And did that till about 2017, 2018. And then, yeah, took on Ohio in 2000, whatever that first year was, 2016. And then, yeah, this year with Ironman purchasing Musselman, was able to bring that under the fold, mostly because Syracuse had been canceled and Geneva, New York is about an hour and 15 minutes from my front door to the race venue. So I was able to bring that in, and yeah, that was going to be a fun one. Some cool changes we were going to make, but I'll just have to wait to 2021 now.
Yeah. Wow, man. I was going to ask, are you generally bumming about what's going on, or how have you been handling it? I mean, what's your state of mind these days right now, other than riding 10,000 feet?
Yeah, it was one of those things where it's like, I feel like the 7 stages of grief, maybe. You know, at first you're like, all right, we got a chance, we're opening up. We're at the end of July. We can do this. And then every day that goes by, you're like, I don't know, this doesn't look good, and then you watch the dominoes fall, right? Like, we were sitting there for a while and it was like, all right, Steelhead's going to happen. Steelhead's going to happen. That's the last week of June. We're going to make it work. We can get into July full swing. And then Steelhead falls, and then the next one falls, and the dominoes fall, and it's just one after the other. And you're like, every day you get closer, you're like, come on, what are we doing here? So yeah, it definitely gets to that point. But, once Musselman falls, and then once, Ohio fell finally, it was kind of a stage of relief in the way of being like, all right, like, we finally have a decision, right? I think that's like most of America is going through right now is, well, at least we did in the beginning, of like, what's the future look like? And now we have that plan, and just like this now, now we have that plan, and now we know how we're moving forward.
I think one of the biggest probably confusions for athletes who aren't familiar with event management and how things are put on is that I think a lot of them think or assume, at least in the past, that the majority, 99 to 100% of what goes on within the race, what's allowed, what's not allowed, communications, are all basically done via race director. And I think a lot of athletes have experience with smaller race management companies or local grassroots events that, that's par for the course. You basically only hear from the race director. They communicate with the city. The event is run on kind of a smaller scale, so it is largely up to the race director, because they kind of own their mini business, or their own little, each race is like a franchise underneath their own business. But with a gigantic brand that is Ironman, that spans not only with just triathlons, but with, like you said, they have Iron Girl, they own the rock and roll events, like it all kind of trickles down from the top. How does the communication, especially with, I think, added confusion the last 80 to 100 days, with people getting upset with, oh well, this race in August has already been canceled, but our one in July hasn't. Why isn't there a standard? And obviously it's a state to state thing based on their phase of reopening. But what is the general like communication channel and flow? What does that usually look like?
So yeah, it actually is starting from the bottom up in a lot of cases now. I mean, corporate offices in Tampa and Boulder are, they've got the protocols and they've got kind of the procedures in place. But I mean, again, let's look at Lubbock, Texas is a different beast, as it's not truly under the WTC brand. It's more of a licensed event. So, and again, Texas is kind of as open in that respect. So that's a different beast. But they have their protocols, but they're like, okay, let's reach out to the city, and what the state is doing, and kind of see where we're going with that. This year, for the first time in a long, I think ever, actually, we did weekly phone calls. For me, it was 2 regions, because Ironman breaks it up into regions. So, we were having weekly calls and Skype chats with our Midwest team for Ohio, and then the Northeast team for Musselman. And it was just the constant communication of what's happening, what's going on here. And it was great having that support system, because what's happening in Atlantic City, that falls in the Northeast, is vastly different than what was happening in Mont-Tremblant and Montreal. And so seeing what was happening there, seeing how those were falling, what they were doing to make things happen. And then again in the Midwest, seeing what Muncie, Indiana is doing versus Benton Harbor, Michigan versus Delaware, Ohio. Mm-hmm. And so it was one of those things where it was just like, all right, these weekly phone calls, the race director gives an update from what the city or the state or whatever local agency you're working with gives the update to our regional director and our regional operations director. And they would take that up to, our North American operations vice president and kind of go from there. And so that was kind of the communication flow. And then once the decision was made, that's where then the flow would reverse and be from the Tampa office. This is what we're using. These are the words we're using. This is the options we can put together for athletes to defer or to go to a different race or postpone until, 2021.
Right. So you guys, so Ironman was depending heavily on you guys to kind of give them updates for what was going on locally in each different place. And so were they at headquarters generally optimistic, or were they kind of just saying, hey, we want to go, but we need you guys to kind of let us know what the situation is? I mean, I'm just curious as to like what their mindset was going through all this. Were they ready to pull the plug, from the get-go, or were you guys kind of saying, hey, no, we got a shot, let's hang in here? Or, I don't know. It's really all pretty confusing in general, I'm sure, how it all went down, but what was their general tone at, the top?
I think, speculating the early stages, when we all thought we'd be reopened by June 1st, I think those early events, that Oceanside, that Super Seal, those were easy because it was just like, all right, this is, we're in this global pandemic. It'll be done soon. We'll, we can postpone or cancel or whatever the first few events. And then it got very much more optimistic. I mean, Ohio specifically was one of them where it was, we waited till the last minute. I mean, there was a PGA tournament 45 minutes down the road. That had a bunch of spectators, and there's NASCAR races that are happening. And, we had worked on these huge presentations. Each venue had to work on a presentation of how you could put on this event while following this laundry list of protocols to make it safe for athletes and spectators to be there, screen checks and swim corrals that were going to be, built out so we could socially distant athletes, just before you got into the water. I mean, talking, 1,500 to 2,000 athletes that you're trying to socially distant in a massive corral that's usually just a standing group. So as we got more and more to June and July, they were definitely more optimistic, and really, again, it came down a lot to cities and states on what they were allowing and what they were going to do. So while Ironman was pushing hard for July events to happen, some of the cities and states just weren't comfortable with it.
It sounds like, and it's so interesting how timing affects everything, is that anything that was like May to August was kind of caught in no man's land. It was kind of too close to the front end of what we were kind of learning and starting to go through with COVID and the whole pandemic and the shutdown, that it was kind of too soon to make a call, but then also might have been too late to make the appropriate adjustments in terms of how states are reopening. Anything early season, it's not an easy call, because I'm sure there's also a tremendous amount of negotiations that have to happen with events like Oceanside or other early season, especially with North American races, like trying to find a date with the city that they can now work in that they hadn't planned on, 6 months down the road. They can do that and at least postpone and then probably work out the kinks in the meantime versus and anticipate that reopening and phases are going to continue to flow the way they are. And then that maybe restrictions will be lax a little bit and they'll have time to kind of, figure things out and work out the kinks and the kind of the return to racing or the Race Smart initiative that Ironman recently just announced. And then you got you guys like Ohio, like you said, Steelhead, Gulf Coast in May, Chattanooga moved to August. It was kind of like you don't want to move it down the road because what if things work out and you moved it for no reason, and then but you kind of had to wait till the last minute, and so you end up stuck. And how impossible, not impossible obviously, but how big of an ask do you feel like it is to these cities to say, hey, we can't have it right now. We'd still love to have it this year. And is that even a possibility? Like, are some cities like even open to those discussions, or like with Ohio, no, it was basically just canceled for this year and they're going to have it next year. Is that even a situation that you would ask them?
Well, again, so at first, I think when those earlier seasons before May were getting postponed, it was easy. But then, there's a few factors. One, if you look at the Ironman schedule now for September between Rock and Roll and Ironman, there's some weekends that have 6 events, across the country. So I think it was easy to kind of postpone them. And like you said, because we were like, all right, September, we're going to be fully going.
Yeah.
But as we got later and later, trying to fit certain events on, because you can't have Atlantic City, Lake Placid, Musselman, and Ohio all on the same weekend. Right. So it started getting a little bit more narrow focused on some of it. And I'm being completely honest, we looked at an October date for Ohio this year, and just weather and having the university in, and just like you said, it was just a huge ask for all the parties involved to try to make an October event happen. We just felt like it was going to be best for, to wait to 2021. But it's one of those things where these cities they're trying to open up as well. They're trying to get their back to business stuff going too. And they have other events, outside of us that come into town, state fairs that are trying to be planned, and all these different festivals and concerts and stuff that are getting moved around, and they're just trying to keep it up, their head above water. So it was definitely a huge ask for a lot of things, a lot of moving parts, a lot of people having to check their calendars and, what it could look like versus what it does look like. So it was a lot. It certainly was a lot to try to look at postponement dates.
So obviously crushing blows for you, man. I mean, you had to cancel both races for the whole year, right? So now you're sitting there. You're just sitting there. I'm real curious because obviously you have to figure out what you're going to do and how you're going to treat the athletes with regard to deferments and other opportunities and things like that, where they can hopefully get back to racing somewhere else maybe, or wait till next year with you. But how does that, as a business owner that you are, what kind of struggles have you been going through in that? And is there support from Ironman, or is there, I don't, this may be getting too personal but like, how do you go about that now? Because that's just stuff that's not coming in for you, and you're kind of at the center of it. It's tough question maybe to tell the world too, but
there's a lot to that. Thankfully, again, as a small business owner, I had some side events, 200, 300 person events, I was cutting back on this year. So thankfully I don't have that. But on the flip side, as far as the race directing for Ironman, I'm hugely thankful for having the support structure behind me, having an athlete services department who's fielding all of those athlete questions, having, a PR team who can put together the right verbiage and put together press releases and put that together, having regional directors who can look at the master schedule for all of North America and say, here's the races we can transfer people to if they want to, or if they'd rather just defer to 2021. To be honest, if I had to do all of that myself, I don't know if I could.
Man, so like how with, the fact that there's probably what, 10 to 12, if not more, different race directors and covering the North American events. I know some of you guys have just one, some people have two or three, but you know, but there's a lot. Like, how are you guys supporting each other? Like, are they bringing in other race directors, that are super knowledgeable like yourself to other events? Like, especially these first ones, like they've got Muncie going on, they're going to have less volunteers. Are they bringing in a lot more higher up, more experienced people to help deal with this? Or are they just going to kind of see how they can run it, normal, because this might be the standard for the next foreseeable future? So we need to figure out how we can make it work with the people that we're going to have at all other races.
Yeah, they're definitely bringing in some more higher level folks. But I think that's again where our weekly phone calls have been helpful. And it's been very nice that our regional directors are talking, across. So our Northwest team is talking to our, Northeast team, and we can kind of bounce ideas. Or, some of these other race companies, like what was it? Spartan just had their Florida race. Okay, what worked there? And so maybe our Mid-Atlantic or our Southeast team can bring some of those ideas to the rest of it. I think these early season races, though, while we do have the race smart, it's trying to see what works, and a lot of it can work on paper, but seeing what can actually work, and see what makes sense and what doesn't, and trying to just fine tune it, every chance we can.
Yeah, so you mentioned, Robbie just mentioned Muncie, and I assume you've been on, not maybe other calls besides your specific race calls or whatever. You've been talking to other race directors and things of that nature. What kind of differences, what's the difference between Muncie and Ohio? Is that like at the local government level? Is that the state level? Why is there, what's the difference in terms of like, hey, we're going to do this race and, somebody else, can't do one 3 weeks differently? Is there major factors that you're noticing, or what do you think it is? I mean, is it just gut feelings on these people? Are they behind, under strict guidelines by the state or local, or is just people like, I don't know. We want to do a lot of things, but maybe this Ironman race is something that's not as, um, we're anxious to get this off the ground. You know what I mean?
Yeah. It's I think it's a lot at the state and the local levels. And I mean, for like in Ohio specifically, okay, while the city, was very hesitant, and we can tell them all, all the race smart and the return to racing stuff that we're going to do, but the state's not ready, and I think that's what happened kind of in Muncie. Well, I think Muncie was the opposite, where the state was like, okay, we're open, let's go. But it's one of those things where the state hasn't issued a permit for the park yet, and the state DOT hasn't issued a permit to using the roads, and we're 5 weeks out, and I don't know if we can get those permits. So it was just a lot of hands, and it's a lot of different, kind of cooks in the kitchen, I guess, trying to make that decision between local government, local parks, state DOT, governor's office, state legislators, regional, all that stuff. Yeah.
Man, so I mean, obviously we don't like to speculate, but I think it's a good question to ask in terms of, obviously you said a few minutes ago that you were kind of the liaison between two major, between the two big parties, the upper end of Ironman, which probably makes some ultimate decisions, and then obviously on the local level with talking to city officials and everyone that needs, like, getting the sense of how they're feeling about it, what can happen, then you kind of the negotiator, I guess, in between. Do you think that, like, that if Muncie wasn't reopening, and like, do you feel like them reopening at such an aggressive scale, obviously the Lubbock 70.3 is a little bit different, but since Muncie was kind of opening and kind of just, I don't say it probably forced the hand. I mean, I know Ironman wants to make money. They're a business just like anyone else. Like, if they can put on and they can do a business, then they're going to be open. But do you feel like if Muncie was like, hey, we're not going to reopen at all, do you think things would have slowed down even more in terms of race cancellations and what they're going to do? Or was it like, hey, Muncie's going to have it a go. We're not necessarily, because the turnaround is still like, I think people are kind of, while it feels like we've been going through this pandemic and these restrictions for a long time, it hasn't been that long.
Right.
And so I think that trying to put on like totally revamping the structure and the outline of these massive events with so many moving parts and so many, political parties, and then you got companies and you have volunteers and you have 3,000 strangers coming to an event, like all these moving parts, like they had to rework this in what I think is a fairly short period of time to be able to appease the fact that Indiana's open, and at least they say they're going to totally open by July 3rd or 4th, then we better figure out a way to have this race, or you're going to have to make a decision that's strictly an Ironman decision and not necessarily a state decision.
Yeah, I mean, it was definitely for Ohio, specifically being that close to Muncie, seeing Muncie reopening and seeing it get close was definitely one of those things where we kept going back, to our local agencies and saying, look, they're doing it. They're open, they're ready to go. Why can't we? Can we make this happen? So definitely, I think Muncie being open definitely made things more difficult as far as postponement for this year. I think that it wasn't helpful. I think if that domino fell of Muncie, it would have been a little bit easier to be like, okay, we're just going to hold off until August 1st and see, and then start taking the August events and going from there.
I might be asking you to speculate a little bit here, but with regard to that, say Muncie, they're going all in. And did you sense that, I guess the thing is okay, so Ohio's like, we're not ready to do this. And the reason why is because, say, we don't want our city to be branded as the one city that let a bunch of people come into town and then all of a sudden a bunch of people got sick. Is that kind of the reason? And did you sense that Ironman was feeling that same thing? Because I've talked to some, a bunch of people about it, and it's like, oh boy, that would be a terrible thing if an Ironman race was sort of like this big spreading ground kind of thing.
The cause of it, yeah.
Is that sort of was that the crux of a lot of this, you think? Or there was some kind of hesitation because, man, we don't want to be the first one. But now that Muncie's going, it's going to, like you said, it's just going to open the gates. If it flies off and everything goes well, and it's like, oh.
Then we can do it, yeah. It's, there was two kind of things. Well, there's a lot of things that we talked about. And even going back to the Musselman idea and Tremblant and, some of the other stuff like with Maine, right? Maine is open, but only for those that live in Vermont, New Hampshire, and Connecticut. Otherwise you got to be on a 14-day quarantine. So that, there was talks of, is it a locals only? Is it Ohio only? Is it, this 3-state region only that can come and race, and we do it small like that? So there was that idea of, let's keep it localized so we're not, spreading it like crazy. But then at the same time, on the other side, that was a big piece of this was not so much the city, not so much of we're bringing, 3,000 people from outside of the state of Ohio into, this smaller, town. It was the supporting agencies. It was, not every one of our medical assets on the bike course could help us because they've all been working overtime for the last 3 months. And if it's over, they're going to want to catch up on their vacation time and go back to regular hours. Or if we're still in this, they're going to continue to work overtime. Or, Ohio Health, our medical, while they could support us, it wasn't, in the full regard that they could. And then volunteers, you guys mentioned it before, volunteers. I mean, there were so many groups that were just not ready because there's so many touch points. And I know we talked, with the return to racing, we've limited the touch points by, 90% or whatever it was. But that's still a 10% touch point that volunteers, it's a lot of education that we'd have to do with volunteers. And I think just some of them were still living in the fear that, they don't want to put themselves at risk. So kind of all those pieces were kind of the epicenter of what makes our decision.
Do you think it's because it's such a, obviously there's right now, I think as much as no one likes to speculate or assume, we're all kind of stuck in that place because it's never happened before. Do you think in a way that some of the new changes that they're making, like you mentioned, volunteers, each event is so heavily dependent on outside help, and a lot of these people are very unfamiliar with triathlon in general. Obviously, they might have friends that are doing. They might just be, organizing something to help out, a local event. But a lot of times, like you said, you need to even before COVID and this pandemic, like you had to educate a lot of these people a lot about what to expect, what to do. In a way, do you feel like this new, Race Smart or Return to Racing initiative that they're kind of implementing and they're requiring most every athlete to just kind of assume that you need to be able to 100% self-support, your entire event, your entire race. Do you think in the future, I think we could all agree, like we hope to get back, sooner rather than later to what racing looks like, like it has before in the past. Do you think some of those will be a positive in terms of, because I feel like as a coach, and you see it a lot when you spectate races, that a lot of athletes still don't know a lot when they come into races. They really, really depend or assume that it's either going to be taken care of, or that a volunteer is going to fix it, or that a bike mechanic is going to change your tire, or that they can come fairly, they can come fully trained and prepared physically. But in terms of logistics and knowing the ins and out of the course and knowing where to go or what not to do, they can be somewhat unprepared. Do you feel like this may impact the future of racing and how athletes, I don't want to say behave, but in a way, behave and take own responsibility? You think that can impact it in a positive way?
I do. I do think some of these things are going to stick. Not that health screening before you enter, that, hopefully ideally will be going away, but some of the other things, I think will potentially stick, kind of the swim start stuff, building out more corrals, giving more space, hopefully, in the venues that can allow it, give more space in transition. And I think a lot of it can positively, because it's one of those things now where it's, if you're forced to be, like you just said, self-supporting, that's only going to be better. And it will take some more education on our part, to help inform these athletes and kind of help them along the way. But I think it's all for the better of the sport. As an athlete, I feel like it's got to be a little tough. It's definitely tough as a race director, sitting there thinking, "Wow, I need you to know more things than what you do know. I need you to be able to be a little bit more self-sufficient. Need you to be able to get through." But at the same time, there's a lot of times where we try to assume that they know, some know more than they do. Mm-hmm. And assuming that X, Y, and Z. And sometimes you go to those athlete meetings and it's like, here's, Ohio, here's your 3 gear bags. This is what, here's how we transport them. Some athletes have never used gear bags. They don't know how a morning clothes bag or a T1 bag gets from point A to point B and where they pick it up. So I think it's some of those things too, where it's just they're going to know more, will be better kind of for the sport as a whole, not even just Ironman, but just for triathlon as a whole.
Interesting. It's almost turning into a year of training and educating that, because when anybody starts, they're all having maybe like those crazy questions like this that seem simple to people that have been around for a long time, but now it's almost kind of force-fed us to look back at different ways, and people that may have been getting into triathlon for the first time this season, now they're just kind of immersing themselves and learning all these things. So yeah, maybe that will be a good thing in a way. As we, sort of go forward, as we look at Muncie and hope that things go well there, and, have you got a general sense for Like maybe what some other places are going to be doing? I don't know. I always have a thing about Wisconsin because I'm from there. I'm actually here right now. And I was just up, I've been all around here, and the state's pretty wide open, but I also know Madison is a hot point for not wanting to open. So it's a weird combination because a lot of the state is all about it, and where the state capital is where the race is, literally, and that doesn't seem like it's going to happen. But I mean, are you generally feeling like a positive movement, or is it just too hard to tell because of it seems like every day there's new information coming out?
I mean, it's definitely one of those things where it was, I think we're moving in a positive way. I think, again, with races starting to happen more and more, smaller events, these 200-person races starting to be successful. It's personally, it's hard to see what the rest of the country is doing living in New York, and kind of most of our decisions being based off of what's happening in New York City. But I think there's going to be a slow progress of, there's events of 200 people, and then there's events of 700 people, and then there's events of 1,000, and then, we can go back to our 30,000 person concerts. But at the same time, I think that's the positive. I think we are moving in that positive direction. But, someone's got to be the kind of the test dummy too, right? I mean, someone's got to be able to put on the event and say, all right, we did it. Or someone's got to put on the event and be like, oh, this did not work out. But someone's got to take that chance, and someone's got to step over the edge and take that leap of faith. But to your point too, about Madison versus the rest of the state, I mean, I look at Boulder, right? And Denver and Boulder County are still closed, but the rest of the state of Colorado is open, which is greatly impacting those races as well.
It's such a, I mean, like you said, like some of the, I even think that like some of the like specific locations, even in certain counties, like Mike and I both predicted Muncie happening long before that we knew the reopening date of the state, how aggressive Indiana was going to be, just because I thought that the location itself was, I would think more inviting to having a large group. You could have a huge transition area. It's kind of, I mean, it's not kind of, let's be honest, it is out in the middle of kind of nowhere. It's not in like a giant city, but it also means resources might be a little bit smaller, but it also means that, it's already harder to find hotels in Muncie. You go to Anderson, you go to even Richmond, Indiana, to find other places. Everything is kind of spread out. It's not like really, impacting a city. Then you look at places, like Madison, who I think on the weekend that they have it currently scheduled now, they've got a home football game, Madison 70.3, and you're thinking, is this even like realistically possible? But I think what you said is also something that I think we all need to be aware of, and I think patient on, is that, and understanding is that these races are, while they're races and they're events that we participate in, you have to open up and figure it out.
Right.
Because if you're not, like, it's like telling, small businesses and the local, mom and pop store that don't open yet, even though you can, don't open yet. Just wait till it's 100%, because they have to figure things out. They have to figure out what's working. They have to figure out how their employees are going to be protected, how they're going to feel safe, how the customers are going to go. Just going to the grocery store, from day one of this thing to now has looked significantly different. Like
Right.
you have to participate. We all have to, I think, go through those and remind ourselves that we don't have to race if we don't want to. Yeah, but we can if we want to, and that's something that we have to, take our own responsibility for, and that we just have to figure this out. And the more that we do things, and the more races that do happen, like I participated in albeit a small trail race this last weekend. It was by 200 or 300 people. You got your temperature check the day before at check-in. You got your temperature check the morning of. You were required to wear a mask right up until the time you started. And while those were kind of, obviously things I'd never and like gone through in a race before, outside of that, it felt kind of the same. You know, like
Yeah.
there was some small change in like the aid stations where, you know, there was less contact, but outside of that, it's still. I think that's one of the things that we are kind of getting caught up on as athletes is that, like, while some of these things are going to make it different, like when you look at the race as a whole and the amount of time you're going to be out there, and oh well, you know, if the fans aren't going to be there, well, let's be honest, you don't see them in the swim, and you sure as heck don't really see them on the bike, so you might miss them a little bit on the run, you know. And
Yeah.
so you think about things like that that are kind of like going to can change like the how maybe the beginning and the end of it, you know, with the race start and then the finish line, but the stuff in the middle, it's largely going to be unchanged, you know, except for
Yeah.
making sure you're a little bit self-supported. So I think we need to remind ourselves that, you know, it's not this gigantic sweeping change that's going to affect every singular aspect of the event, swim, bike, run. I mean, most triathletes have been like, thank God I get 6 feet in transition. I'm used to like 6 inches. You know, they're like,
Yeah.
thank God, I hope that stays.
Right.
But I see positives in that we get these opportunities and we at least get a chance to kind of figure it out in what sounds like, you know, having read it, a fairly safe manner.
Yeah, I mean that was so. I kind of mentioned it before. Each race had to put together a presentation to take up to our COO and our vice president of operations for North America. You know, we had to put together a presentation, and just as you said, in that presentation, we had aspects that we had to highlight on what we could change and what we could do to fit such guidelines. And those changes mostly were expo. You know, it's if you're handing out food, you've got to do single serve. You can't do anything reusable. You've got to, you got to sterilize in between. You know, athlete check-in. There was talks of doing staggered where it was, last name A through Z could do, or, A through K could do this, or, we allotted, people, based on 200 people per hour could come in kind of thing. Limiting how many people are coming through expo, or, giving you different exit points or more exit points out of expo in case you wanted to, you didn't want to be in bigger groups. And then it came down to the finish line, because like you said, once you got from swim start, we talked about the bigger corrals, but once you got in the water, you had a little bit more space in transition. You might have to grab your own cup at an aid station. And that's really about it. I mean, swim, bike, run, you're pretty socially distant to begin with. I mean, unless you're cheating and drafting on the bike course, but that's neither here nor there. But, and then finish line. Okay, so then we just, a lot like most marathons, while you still come through the same arch, you might have two different corrals, exiting the finish line. So there just isn't a huge backup of athletes, all crowding in the finish line. And those are the biggest changes. And like you said, a lot of it's going to be positive stuff.
Ken, I'm real curious. First of all, triathletes, you would assume that triathletes are very healthy people, or on the front edge of health in general. And I'm wondering if you guys, because sometimes when I go through an Ironman, I kind of get chills and I feel sick. There's a thing that goes on there too. And what did you guys? Is there like a I'm sure you probably didn't, but my thought process on this is the idea that everyone is kind of a little bit anxious about all this stuff in general, and then how that can seep into someone's head, because people go through their moments while they're racing these things, where they're feeling like terrible, and so is there some kind of discussion about like, hey, it's sort of natural race kind of blah sickness or whatever versus actually, contracting some kind of virus during the race?
To be honest, if there was, I wasn't a part of those conversations. I know that we talked about increasing medical staff, both during expo, check-in on Friday, Saturday, and then also on Sunday. But as far as I hadn't gotten, mostly because we were canceled, I did not get into as much of the athlete education that is supposedly, that's supposed to be happening for those events that are happening.
Do you think that, this is kind of a spin in a different direction, Do you think? I mean, there's a lot of factors in this, and obviously there's like a gigantic bike boom happening right now across America. Like bike
Yeah.
shops are straight sold out. Like I work
Yeah.
with one athlete who manages a store, and they're all out of bikes. And I have a guy that owns a store, and he says this is the busiest they've been in 5 years. And
Yeah.
I think, I think it's just incredible. I think that's a huge positive for the sport. And going back to what Mike said earlier about this being like a year of training and possibly and hopefully education, that we can really kind of lower the bar down to what I would hope is a much more inclusive, welcoming, mat getting or entry into endurance sports and triathlon. And I also think that the virtual series is actually going to be a huge help in terms of growing the sport, because I think it gives people, while I'm not a huge fan of it in some ways because there is no swim, so it basically makes it, a duathlon,
Yeah.
but it does allow people a somewhat free opportunity to experience in the safety of their own home without being maybe intimidated or having those kind of like nerve-wracking anxious factors of walking up to a race with 1,000 or 3,000 people where you're afraid to ask questions. You can kind of start to kind of dip your toe into triathlon in the safety of your own home.
Yeah.
You're not going to get the full experience, but do you think, we talked about empowering athletes, not really empowering, but kind of forcing them to learn more and be
Mhm.
more responsible, combining that with the bike boom and the advantages that there is of having access to use virtual racing. Do you think this is actually going to help our sport?
You know, the biggest thing that I've been worried about of all of this is what we're going to do when we're reopen, right? We have so many people that are either out of work, furloughed, on unemployment, just working from home, whatever it is, that when you can return to the office or you can return to your job site, that we just go back to that. And we go back to the American way of all I do is work, eat, and sleep, and that's it. And that's the biggest thing that I worry about is now people are finally taking into, now that they've got some time on their hands, people are finally taking their health and their activity level to the next level. And that when we get to go back to working, that we're all going to become the workaholics that we were before. It's work first, everything else second. And that's my biggest fear of it all. Steve Del Monte of Delmo Sports. If you haven't followed his Instagram, he's got some pretty good stories, and he's one guy with Atlantic City who's had some trouble. But he made a good point that it's too bad that we all can't just reset for 1 month. Just take a full month at some point off, clear our minds, clear our heads, do what we want to do every day, and not worry about the burdens of what your supervisors were telling you. And so while I really do hope it helps our sport, and the VR series is, I think it's great with that kind of I forget what the beginner level and then the elite levels are. I think those are great, but I just worry that when we get back to working our 40 hours a week, that's going to be coming, our full mindset again.
Mm. That's an interesting angle, man. I hadn't really thought of it that way. Because I also see it as more and more people have been working at home and learning that, man, I'm wasting an hour every day on a commute that I don't need to waste every day, or stand around the water cooler or whatever it may be. It is time that I can maybe start thinking about myself and getting back into shape. And, I guess that I could see both of those things certainly happening, with some people are like, wait a minute, what have I been doing?
Yeah. And
I
that's
need
what
to
I hope.
take.
That's what I'm hoping. I'm hoping people are realizing, like you just said, like, what am I doing with my life? Like, I should take some more time for myself.
Yeah.
Well, I think I definitely see that concern. And I think that's true with everything. Like even with like we have these moments in our lives where we see things, and we're watching a show or a documentary, or we're reading a book, or we see an event, and we think, gosh, like I'm really overcomplicating my life. Like, do I
Mm-hmm.
really want or need all these extra things? And then life continues to happen, and then you wake up the next day and it's like you never had that thought, because you're caught right back up in the rat race, that we're all in. And while it's slowed down for us, for a period, it's interesting how we are all kind of uprooted in chaos, and then how many people have just kind of rerouted back into this normal routine, and then they'll get broken back as things change again. But one of the things that I've found really fascinating as a coach, with that works with athletes, is that they have never felt that there was a more important time in their triathlon life to keep training. And while there hasn't been, like, obviously the difficult part with, you find with motivation and with racing and with, like the fact that, athletes love to have a race on a calendar. They get excited for it. We all get excited for racing. Let's just be honest, we wouldn't be doing this if we didn't. But that even with no races on the calendar, so many of them have found and even kind of communicated that, like, if I didn't have something like on my schedule to train for right now, I don't know what I would be doing, because you're stuck at home. You may be stuck at home, your kids might be home, you're now working remotely, and it's like you're getting comfortable inside. And now if you didn't have that like release to get out and get fit, then and enjoy being outside, that they would be even more unhealthy. So I think it's going to be interesting to watch. Kind of, you said, is like, are people going to retreat back into, maybe even trying to play catch up? Like, oh, I missed all this time at work, I've got to overwork, to play catch up. I mean, I've kind of honestly found myself like that in the last 2 weeks, since our almost our 4-year, he'll be 4 next month, is back in daycare. And I feel like I've got more work done the last 2 weeks and in the first 2 months. But then I also this weekend was like, but wait a minute, you were doing just fine the last 3 months. Like, I think we overwhelm ourselves, and I really hope that athletes and we as kind of a human race sit back and think that, we can still kind of make things work just fine and still take time for ourselves and not be so overworked. And really, not overworked, it's just, we don't have to keep ourselves busy all the time to still be productive and treat ourselves the way we should and be healthy.
Right. Agreed. 100%.
Okay.
Yeah, we're such a controversial podcast here.
We all agree with that. Yeah,
we all agree with that.
And again, I think, just to reiterate it, I think that's the big thing, right? Is like, we all need to not take on so much stress. I'm trying to think of what that book is. It's like Calm the F Down or whatever it is, or Don't Stress the F Out or whatever it's called. But
there's a lot of Mark Manson, maybe.
I think, yeah. But it's just one of those things where it's like, I mean, like you said, we're just burdening ourselves so much with. I mean, I look back at years. I spent years where it was like, especially the mid 2000s when Syracuse was selling out. It's like, I got to sit behind the computer. I've got to do this. And it's like, did I really? Did I have to do that? Like, we've got emails on my phone. I could have been out for a ride answering emails, doing that kind of stuff. I could do the Tom Zebart, if you guys know Tom, like taking conference calls while I'm out for my Century ride. If I got to talk.
Is that better? I don't know. It's some kind of an interesting.
I guess there's maybe a mix in there, but it's Tom's always funny. He's like, if I ever had to talk, I just pull over, unmute, talk, come back on mute, go back riding.
Well, I guess you could prove this by data. If more people are interested in triathlon right now, are your races for 2021 sold out already?
We're starting to see. I mean, I haven't seen too many numbers. I've seen mostly the rock and roll side of things, like Rock and Roll DC's being seen as a huge number of registrations already. So I know that a lot of people are taking those deferments and moving on, and that's I think another one too is. Part of it is, if you looked at our registrations, we shut down registrations early just to kind of limit how many people were coming to an event. And I think that's where a lot of these deferments to other races is we're trying to not overcrowd a lot of races in 2020. Again, just because we don't want to dump 3,000 people into, a Lake Placid to try to find out the hard way that's worked. So I think we are starting to see some good numbers for 2021. But I haven't seen like true data yet myself.
what if any, and I have to feel like it's some. Do you feel like some of like what's complicated the issues with some races taking place or being postponed or just canceled this year and pushed next year? I mean, to be honest, like the purchasing of Ironman probably couldn't have come in a worse time. Like the sale and purchase, So do you think any of that huge transaction and how that's going to be phased in? I obviously don't know the ins and outs of the acquisition, but do you feel like that's made it harder to make some of these decisions? Because I mean, the way I would see it is that like the new owners, when Wanda sold them, I think the group starts with an A. I can't remember what they're called actually. I'm sure you know.
Advance.
Yeah, Advance. Yeah, so
Yeah.
you got to think that they surely don't want every race deferred to next year because all of that capital will have been gone to Wanda. And so like they're going to
Right.
lose out on a whole year of revenue. So do you feel like that has played any part into the decision making? But I mean, obviously Ironman can only make certain things happen up until the point they're allowed on the city and state level.
If it has, it would be through those higher level, C-level folks down in Tampa. And when it comes down to myself, it could have been Wanda, it could have been Advanced, it could have been the previous owners, Providence Investment Company, whatever it was before.
Mm-hmm.
Operationally, we don't see anything different when it gets down to the race director and really the regional operations manager. We don't see much of a difference. Operationally, that's, as we kind of are always told, like that's what works really well, and that's what brings people to Ironman is how we operate. So I think, well, yeah, it was definitely kind of a push. I don't think, if we were still under Wanda, I think we would still be under just as much scrutiny to try to get events to happen.
Got it.
One more quick question on the registration stuff, and for people that they're deferring. I'm supposed, like, I haven't signed up for anything specifically this year anyway, but I was kind of curious if these, say Muncie goes off well and then things start going the right direction. Do you think that these there will be opportunity for people to kind of get on board a little later in the year and go race, or are races kind of shut down as far as registration goes, or are they trying to limit that still, or is there any sense for that?
I think they're trying to limit just the early stuff to try to figure it out. But I think those later September, October events, if things go well, I would fully expect a spike in what people are seeing. And I mean, there are people, based on, the Facebook comments that I've seen for my two events, some people are ready to get back to racing, and some people are like, we shouldn't have an event at all in 2020. And you got kind of both polar opposites there. But I think if it starts going well, those that are ready to race will flock to the events that we have open. And kind of going back to what you were talking about motivation wise, a lot of these folks thinking that, again, going back to the Facebook comments, a lot of people were saying, before we had postponed, saying, I'm still training, I'm still going for this event. And that's what's motivating me. And I think once an event postpones, they lose that motivation. But I think if they see events go well, those motivated athletes that want to race in 2020 will flock to the ones that are open for sure.
How hard is it? Because I cringe oftentimes if I make the mistake of seeing an Ironman Facebook post from either corporate or
Yes.
from, like races. And then God forbid any race director ever takes the misstep of hopping into one of the closed Facebook groups.
I'm all of them. I'm in both of mine.
How hard is it to filter out what you feel is right personally, as a husband and father, and as a person on this planet, to also protecting and trying to provide the best product for the people who are going to race versus doing what's best for your company or the people you work for, versus reading like the there it's all the black and white comments for it's either you shouldn't race at all this year, and frankly, no one should be racing in 20 or 21,
Yeah.
until we all get a robo vaccine chip implanted in our neck that makes us immune to life. You got that end, and then you've got, I don't see why, we're not racing right now. This is all, a conspiracy. This is, you got both ends of the spectrum. How do you filter that? And because I think people forget that you guys are human and that you
Yeah.
have to read these things and you have to go home, and how do you not take it so personally? And does it make your day? Does it ruin your day? And after doing this for such a long period of time, have you mastered yet, like, being able to not take any of it personally?
So I'm going to go back. I'm going to go way back. I'm going to make this a very long story. Hopefully it's not too boring to you and your listeners. So personally, now I've gotten better. I've gotten it to the point where if it's going to bother me, it only bothers me for, maybe an hour or two.
Still, that's like you're on thread, and that might take up 48 hours of your week.
Yeah, very much so. And thankfully I don't follow slow twitch. If I got into the slow twitch black hole, I would be done.
Yep.
But it's definitely some of that stuff. And I think I'm thankful that my supervisors that I can report to on the regional level are supportive, and I can voice my opinion, and they can take that into consideration, and process that for me and move that information up. Ohio, well, it's like, okay, we're pushing on it. I'm like, personally, I'm not into it, but, I believe in what Ironman's doing with the return to racing. And I think if we can execute X, Y, and Z, we can make this work. So it's also part of it as a buy-in from me into what Ironman's doing and believing what they're doing. That said, I go back to, one of your comments was remembering that we're all humans. And I remember when I did my internship with Ironman back in 2007, I made a mistake with that inaugural Ironman Louisville post-race survey, something like that. And I got an email back that said, you should go back to flipping hamburgers at McDonald's, you uneducated piece of...
Wow.
Yeah. And that was 13 years ago, and I still vividly remember that.
Yeah, man. It stings.
It does. And it's one of those things where, people will come at you, and for a long time, those would fester, and I would sit on it. But the one that kind of, and I absolutely hate to say this, but, the passing of the athlete at Ohio, that was kind of where I learned the most that I had to turn some of it off. And not just so much of people, coming at Ironman and saying that we need to do X, Y, and Z to make it safer and do this. We already try to do the safest things we can. We were adding some other safety protocols. But on the flip side too, people trying to blame and place blame on the athletes and saying that didn't follow this, didn't follow that, didn't do this, didn't do that, they were wrong, they were right, like all that. And just seeing completely both sides of it, and just morally and emotionally trying to reconcile it all. I think that's where I got the best, was in the last 2 years of just saying, this is what I've got to be able to separate myself, and I've got to be able to not take it personally. Because for a long time I did. A lot of times I took a lot of it personally. And one of the things that my wife and my wife's not an athlete at all, but it's funny. I proposed to her the same month I took the job at Ironman. So we've been a triathlon family from the beginning. And my kid, who's just turned 5, I think has been to over 50 events, between small events and Ironman events. I always joke he's worked at 50 events, because those are the events that I've been working at. But it's, so we're triathlon families, so we like to ingrain ourselves in the community. I like to try to be a part. I actually enjoy being part of those those groups. I always call them the black market channels of the Ironman. the unofficial pages, because a
Mm-hmm.
lot of it, you can, again, going back to the education side, we can get a lot more education out that way, because they tend to ask questions that are so in depth that you can really get a lot of information out. And some of the athletes, I should say most of the athletes, are supportive and can help educate new athletes, or inexperienced athletes as well.
Right.
But some of it, they will come at you. They will attack you as a human being. And sometimes you do it in person too. I remember canceling Syracuse during a lightning storm. It was my very first Father's Day. My kid was 3 weeks old. And I'm standing in a lightning storm yelling at people to take cover and transition because they're standing in a field with metal bike racks. And someone yells out sarcastically, "Happy Father's Day to you." Thanks. I kill them with kindness. Thanks, you too. Have a great day. That's mine.
Yeah. The athlete intensity can probably make that worse sometimes, especially at a race situation where they're there and they want to go after it, and then all of a sudden, I mean, I get it. I've been a little upset when the swim's been short and here and there in my day.
You know where you can find the most angry athletes on race day? Bike checkout.
Oh, interesting.
Okay. And yeah, we'll have to do some interviews this year.
If you stand there and you tell them bike checkout starts at 2:00 because the bike cutoff's at 1:45, at 1:15, half an hour to 45 minutes before bike checkout starts, they will sit there and they get irate. I've got to make my plane. I've got to do this. That's the one. If you want to see some angry athletes, that's where you got to go.
Interesting. That it kind of makes sense. Let's be honest. It kind of makes sense because those are also some of the athletes at the point of your end who get done really, really fast and aren't interested in hanging out in the community. They just want to get their bike and go and get their award and be gone.
Yeah, they finished at 11:00. They've been around for 2 hours.
Yeah, there is no race. There is no current race going on if I'm not the one participating in it.
Yeah.
The other,
it's just upset I was when I couldn't get into transition one morning.
Well, that's because you were late that day.
I was late.
And I will have to say, like, it's your, Mike and I were both at Ohio last year as spectators, and we were there obviously with the unfortunate day, and it was obvious to me as we kind of spoke after the race how humbling isn't the correct word, but it seemed all very real for you in terms of how hard you were taking it and how personal. I think athletes sometimes forget. I think, as you already mentioned, Steve Del Monte does an excellent job of humanizing himself via social media. And he still gets his share of people that complain, and he seemingly does a pretty good job of just kind of let it roll off his back. But that you guys are human, and that you feel things just like everyone else, and that you have this gigantic responsibility as the face of this brand and this event, that if people have a horrible time, then you hear about it. And if people have a great time, well, they just tell their friends. they don't really come. It's not like people hop on to give feedback. That's why I refuse to read things like Yelp reviews, and that's usually like the two opposite ends of the spectrum. In terms of what you get feedback for. And the only other thing I wanted to kind of touch on in terms of, because I really wanted this podcast to be more about just hopefully informing the triathletes in general as a whole, and that are new to the sport and may not understand why or why not things are happening, and it comes down to communication. And that's one of the biggest things that I've read that's been the biggest complaint is, why is there not more communication? Why is there no more communication? This race has been canceled in, Japan, and I haven't heard anything about my 70.3 in 8 weeks. And they feel like it's like an apples to apples comparison. And as I've never been in your position before, and I'm huge on communicating, but I think athletes have to understand that, especially for the races happening within that no man's land window that we reference, May, June, July, August, is that sometimes the best communication is no communication, because you can't know anything until you know it. And that's how everything is right now. You're not going to know. I mean, I literally have athletes texting me 5-7 days a week that are just saying, hey, I just found out my pool is opening tomorrow. Everything is happening on such real time that there is no point, in my opinion, there is no point in communicating anything other than a firm, concrete statement. not a, hey, we're still kind of thinking about how things are going to go. We're not really sure, because all that's going to do is drive more anxiety, more panic, more questions, more frustrations, because then the response is going to be, oh, why don't you know? Because Steelhead's been canceled, so why hasn't this race been canceled? Or Muncie's going on. So I think for athletes, like, I'm sure one of the biggest things you deal with is like when to communicate, and I'm sure this comes from up top or below, but
Yeah.
when you communicate and how you communicate matters. And that sometimes, like, if you don't, like, in my opinion, no news is good news. And you can't make plans around maybes and assumptions. And I think, I want to give you the floor for a minute to kind of go on to like why, you guys don't, I think people expect like weekly emails on the status and progress of the cancellation or the postponement or the being in limbo and what that's like.
Yeah, I think you touched on a lot of things. So one of them is we don't communicate until we have all the information. It's exactly that. We don't want to be like, well, maybe we might have this event or maybe we might not, because it does that. And we want to have all of that. We want to have all our ducks in a row before we say anything. And that's the big one. And sometimes, and that's why, like a Musselman, why it took a long time to get out the options, because we wanted to make sure that we had all the options in place before we emailed. And that's, why there was almost, I think, close to 3 weeks between them. But again, and sometimes it's the local governments, it's the local agencies getting us their information, getting us it from them. Sometimes it takes a while for them because I know dealing with, what is it? Yeah, dealing with one of the local agencies here in Syracuse, they're getting little information from the state, and so they don't want to make a decision without state guidance, but the state's not sharing any information. So, ultimately we're trying to wait for the state to make a decision, but the state's trying to figure it out day by day. And so it definitely is one of those things where we just want all the information. We want to provide the best information, the most accurate information for those athletes. And it is tough because, as we're seeing right now, not every state is on the same timeline. It's New York is just opening while some of those, Southeast states are just starting to close up more. So, we're all kind of just going venue by venue individually. Again, going back to Steve Del Monte, talking to Atlantic City, our weekly calls with him, I use this a lot. He's always saying, South Jersey versus North Jersey is two different worlds. It's like South Jersey's ready to open. We're ready to go. Yeah. North Jersey, they're still not ready. They're still closed down. So, yeah, it's one of those things, just making sure we get all the information, making sure that we're doing right by our athletes to make those decisions before we, put out that information.
Mike, do you mind if I ask a quick question and follow up on that?
Go ahead.
Do you feel like, as frustrating as it has been for the athletes in terms of understanding that it's all state by state, case, do you see, like, listening to you talk about it like in that way, do you feel like it would even be possible if tomorrow the whole country opened and races were on, that the events that you guys would be prepared to put on that many events with all these new responsibilities and all these new procedures in place? Do you feel like it would even be possible to have that many races go on at once without kind of a phased in trial approach with Lubbock and then Muncie and then who owes next? Do you feel like that would even be possible?
I don't know, to be honest. I think mentally, as a company, everyone's ready to go.
Yeah.
Everyone's, if you said the country's open for the events that have not been postponed yet or canceled yet, I think we would be ready to do it. And I think we would have our procedures in place, but those procedures are going to change each week. Mm-hmm. Because whatever worked in Lubbock, then we'll take it to Muncie, and whatever worked in Muncie, then we could take to, Boulder, and whatever worked in Boulder, we can kind of snowball what has worked and what hasn't worked to those events. So I think as a company, we would be ready. the one thing that I would be worried about is, are all our supporting agencies ready to do that?
Yep.
Are all our volunteers mentally ready? But as race directors, as regional directors, as corporate office go, we're all chomping at the bit. We're all, once an event falls kind of thing, it gets postponed, your phone as a race director blows up from everybody and being like, hey man, I'm sorry to hear it. Hopefully we can get you back soon. Hopefully we can get this race going, and the support. So as a group, we're ready to go, and I think we could do it. But again, it would operationally be a lot of work just trying to flow with the changes within essentially a 2-day span. Because an event on Sunday, we'd have to be ready to implement it by Wednesday.
Wow. Well,
Wow.
we're going to find out.
Yeah. Got a few weeks here.
We just got to.
Are you planning on going to any races, Kenny?
I might head up to Lake Placid. Is
that September?
Yeah. In the Midwest, they pushed off to the fall. We haven't really talked dates yet, just because we're trying to still see who's still standing come August. In Maine, I think Maine was kind of on the short list. So
yeah.
But again, they're in need of people because of having 4+ events. Right now, back when I think Ohio 2017, we were a 4-race weekend with Victoria and Tremblant and all this other stuff. That they were struggling then. Now, if we're looking at 4 to 6 events, it's going to be
nuts.
It's going to be nuts, yeah. So we got to just try to figure out who's still standing at the end of the day, and then where do they need people.
Do you think the 70.3 Ironman on the same day is a test model for the future?
So we tried it. I don't know if you guys remember this. We tried it in, was it North Carolina?
Yeah, and it's also in Canada last year, right?
Yeah. I think it works. I don't know how it works as an athlete, but I know as a staff member, it's a nightmare.
Interesting.
Because for a 70.3, you wake up at 4 and you work nonstop from 4 until about 8 p.m. For a full, you've got
3 to 3 probably.
Well, it's essentially, it's really about 3:30 until about 8 a.m. the next day.
Jesus.
Thankfully, on course, guys, like I've worked Placid full on the bike course. We started at 2 a.m. on race day, and we finished at 9 p.m. that night on race night. Oh my God. But wait, the transition guys, they're up at 3:30, 4 o'clock, and they break it into 2 shifts. So if you're at the 4 a.m. shift, you usually work until the first finisher, which is usually 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And then you come back at 11 o'clock that night and you work till 8 a.m. the next day. If you're the day shift, you usually come in at 11 a.m. and you'll just work through until midnight, 3 a.m. the next day. The problem is when you do the 70.3 and the full at the same time, for the full guys, there is no break. So you are going from 3 a.m. all the way until midnight with no break. Because as soon as you get done with the 70.3 finishers, swimmers, you have the full swimmers. And by the time you're done with the full swimmers, your 70.3 bikes are already starting to roll back in.
Yeah, man.
And as soon as the 70.3 bikes are done rolling in and they're out on the run, the full bikes start rolling in. And then you've got 70.3 finishers by the time, the full runners are getting out and the bike's finishing there. So it's this just constant motion of people. And so from a staff standpoint, I know it's a nightmare. But I do think from a drag on a community, it's got to be better.
Yeah. Because,
again, look at a Lake Placid where you're bringing all those people in for 2 separate weekends. You're asking the same things. If you can ask for all of that support from a community in a 3-day span versus a 6-day span, yeah, it'd be better. So I don't know. It'd be interesting.
Yeah. I was kind of shocked that when they moved Chattanooga 70.3, they didn't move it to the. I was anticipating the day of or the day before for the full, because their transition is so huge that they could have had that many. I just think it's interesting, but it makes sense to hear on the back end of how absolutely horrendous it is from management. Which, I mean, to be honest, if it's that hard on you guys, it has to in some way impact the athlete experience, and that's what a lot of people remember.
Yeah, and I think some communities like a Chattanooga where the city could probably handle it. I bet their outreaches of the bike course, some of those smaller, medical services might not be able to give you 2 back-to-back days.
Got it.
Something like that, like Geneva. How am I going to really ask the town of Romulus to support me with 3,000 people 2 days in a row?
Right.
Or Marion County or Morrow County, in Ohio. We have 5 officers from them to support the bike course. That's a tough ask now. How are we going to do it in 2 days? So, yeah.
Enlightening as always.
Absolutely.
Man,
the question we just jumped into this. I feel like I forgot, never asked. How are you guys doing?
Oh,
how is life on your end? We jumped straight into this. How is the coaching life?
People don't care about us. They're going to listen to us because they care about you and they care about Ohio and want to figure out what your email.
We talk about ourselves all the time.
As a human being, I'm interested in how you guys are doing.
I'm better. It was a rough couple months for me. Yeah, with Hayden being at home for 90 days straight, and Allie and you can't complain because Allie and I are both obviously super fortunate to still be able to work, but managing that with Hayden at home, he's super high energy and was definitely challenging. As a coach, it's a period in time I will never forget in terms of races changing and restrictions and having to take basically swimming off the schedule for every single athlete. I hated. But then I kind of felt like every other triathlon coach does year round. And then and then having them ease back in, and then but to be honest, we have such an outstanding group of athletes. We haven't lost any.
I was going to ask how. Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, it just they love to train. They love to be a part of it, the community, and they love to keep working hard. And I think most of them is I think a lot of them have actually gained a new respect and perspective for how training can positively impact their life with no race. You do it. So I'm racing to complete this race in a certain time. And then you remove those and you see all these other benefits. It relieves my stress. It helps me deal with my emotions. It helps me be a better spouse and a better husband or father. All those things, I think it's kind of been enlightening to see the positive mental and emotional benefits that training does for so many athletes. It's definitely been challenging. We canceled one camp. We're actually having our first camp at the end of this month.
Nice.
And people, I think it's the same. There have been a few people that haven't felt comfortable coming, so we let them. We gave them a plethora of options. But a lot of people, and I think this is probably true for a lot of people racing, is that they're coming to train, but under the disguise of training. But what they really want to do is just freaking see other people, and just get out and see other people and just be in the middle of other people that have been going through the same things they've been going through, and they're still training, and just get that energy back. And I think that's why people are also excited about racing, is you get a lot of energy. But outside of that, it's been tough, but we get to do stuff like this for a living, and I can't really complain about that.
Yeah. And we're getting the hub open. We're moving, the training center in Chattanooga. I've been in Nashville.
I saw that.
Yeah, so, and I've been, we've been trying to time that out a little bit. It's taken a little longer than we thought, maybe on some level. And I've been trying to sell a house in the meantime. I just did that. So I'll be moving down there. So we've been a lot of that. And like you said, canceled camps and things of that and races. So there's been a weird lack of interaction because we're always meeting with our athletes and hanging out and training together and stuff like that. So I'm moving down in a couple of weeks officially, and
because have you been splitting time?
Not really. I mean, I'll go down there once in a while.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
maybe once in a while. Yeah, like once every 2 months. Yeah, but we've been separated and apart for too long. It's time for our friendship to be rekindled within a 10-minute radius. But yeah, we got a lot. That's the thing. We got a lot of exciting things coming up. But it's I'm excited to see some races happening. We got one athlete doing Buffalo Springs or Lubbock, whatever they call it now.
Whatever you call it,
Yeah, in 2 weeks, and then quite a few doing Muncie.
Oh, good.
Yeah, we actually had a lot looking at Ohio, and then it was kind of funny, obviously if you're listening to this podcast, that I was Facebook messaging you, and then like you agreed to be on the podcast, and literally like 12 hours later you were like, race is canceled. I was like, oh well,
Yeah.
it's even better. That's perfect timing. But Mike and I are both doing great. But for those of you who this may be one of your very first guest podcasts you've listened to, go back and listen to Kenny's other podcast that he's been on with us. He is incredibly informative. If you're ever on the verge of signing up for Ohio and you feel like you shouldn't or you just don't know, the very first podcast he did for us is, I think, one of the most informational podcasts we've ever had in terms of really highlighting, like you just said about Lake Placid, like that someone gets up at like 2 or 3 a.m. and goes back out and sweeps the course. Right, and marks the course. Like there's just a lot, stuff that goes on, so much behind the scenes that nobody sees. And it's and the race goes off, awesome. I think a lot of people complain because there's 2 transitions and whatever. But hopefully there'll be a lot less complaining after this year when people are just happy to get back out there. But go back and listen to those. Ohio is a great venue. It's a really cool town as well.
And next year will be our 5th event. This year we were scheduled for 5th event, and so I got some celebration things planned.
Oh,
Cranking it
to
up.
mark up that 5th year.
Do I hear pizzas, Coke, and Snickers?
No, sorry, you still get the grilled chicken and burgers. You know what I got to do? I just need to order a pizza at 10 a.m. and just give it to you at 6 p.m. I just need to sit on it for like 8 hours and then give it to you guys.
Dude, I'd still have it, man. I would still.
Well, so funny enough, when we all were doing this race to return to racing thing, we were talking about sanitation and stuff, and again going back to those Lake Placid, those long hours. I texted who is now my operational regional director, but we spent years working on the crew together on site, on transition and finish line at Lake Placid, and I go, so does that mean I can't eat 10-hour-old pizza on a box with my trash-covered hands? Like, does that mean sanitation is out? Yeah, is that, now that we're so worried about cleanliness, does that mean I can't do that anymore? Because at 3 a.m. and you've been picking up trash for hours and you see food and haven't eaten in 6, you're kind of anything goes.
You gotta do what you gotta do, man.
Man. Build the immunity, bro.
And that's it. Exactly. So yeah, that's what I'll do. Is I'll get some French fries and some pizza. Let it sit out in the sun for a few hours, and I'll make sure you guys get that.
My man.
All right.
I'm gonna quote you on that.
Take
You heard it
care
here.
of us, man.
Podcast 373. You heard it here first. Good deal.
Man, we're gonna miss you this year, buddy.
We will,
I
man.
know I've been making those phone calls today, and that's the hardest part is these relationships we build, with the people around the race community and not seeing them. That's probably been the hardest thing for me is seeing those athletes, seeing guys like you, seeing our vendors, and just being like, hey, it's be another 365 days before we get to see you again. So it's tough. For
It'll
sure.
make it that much more worth it when you do.
Well, you should come to one of our run camps or something.
Oh, running? Come on.
Yeah, it's like
that.
exactly.
You can be the chef.
Oh, all right, I can do that. All right, I'll do that. Or I'll do
chef.
a bike feed out. I can do midway aid station stuff. I can do any of that.
We'll see what we can work out then.
All right.
Well, Kenny, dude, as always, huge pleasure having you on. I had a lot of fun, learned a lot, and I know all the listeners will take a lot from it as well. So enjoy yourself, enjoy those 80-mile Inferno rides that you're doing, and we look forward to having you back on again soon.
Awesome. Yeah, it's always a pleasure talking to you guys. I really appreciate it.
All right, buddy. Thanks, man.
See you, man.